Okay, so this is the monthly meeting of East Norwalk Neighborhood Association for May 15th, 2023. I'm Diane Cece. Our co-pilot for this evening is ENNA volunteer Scott Goodwin. Thank you, Scott, for that. The agenda for this evening, don't be intimidated by this. It's a whole bunch of items, but basically what we're going to do is I'm going to make just a couple of announcements quick, and then we're going to introduce P&Z Director Steve Kleppin. The purpose of tonight's meeting is for him to do a zoning regulations update review that's specific to 06855. East Norwalk Neighborhood Association. We do recognize that there are folks from other areas on here, but we ask if you can first let the actual residents of East Norwalk proper ask questions first, and then we can open it up. Then just some quick updates on other current business. The Cemetery Mill Pond appeal is ongoing. We'll be doing updates on that via the newsletter. A couple of emails ago, you saw that the 49 Van Zant multifamily application was withdrawn. We're not sure on the status of that, if that's coming back in some other iteration. And we can start to talk about some other items that are related to the state DOT and possibly some upcoming meetings on that. In terms of the announcements themselves, just want to remind folks that this coming Wednesday, the 17th, the Charter Revision Committee is having another public hearing. I think that this is the formal legal public hearing that they're required to hold for the draft recommendations that they're making. And just want to remind folks that we know one of the controversial items that people like to speak to, among other things that are in there, is they have decided to keep in the proposal to convert to a 4-year mayoral term. The link to the documentation for all of that, the link for Zoom and all the information was in our prior email. If you're on this meeting and you haven't received our past emails, you can email us tonight. And if you get that to me either tonight or before noon tomorrow, I can resend this out to you. And then also on the same night, on Wednesday, May 17th, at the Zoning Commission, this is not a public hearing, but it is what they call a preliminary review. It's an application for a single family residence on 289 East Avenue. We don't normally follow these too closely unless there's something that jumps out at us. But in this particular case, given the high interest in the Mill Pond itself after the cemetery application, we thought folks might be interested in this. The link to the architectural drawings and all the details on this, again, were in our Saturday email. And if you need to get that, just let us know. But you can always get zoning application, all of the documents, by going to the city zoning website as well. Okay, so we have tonight, and we're very grateful that P&Z Director Steve Kleppin can join us. Folks may have attended other sessions on what is the plan to upgrade the proposed zoning map for the city of Norwalk. There were 2 public sessions dealing with the changes themselves, and then another session introducing the map. Mr. Kleppin and his staff have also been updating the Planning and Zoning Commission. Those YouTube videos of his review with them are available on the city's website and on the city's YouTube channel. And I'm going to actually ask Steve at some point if those might be able to be posted on the zoning regulations site, just so that people don't have to go to too many places to get caught up there. And then in addition to that, Steve and his staff have been going to various neighborhood associations and stakeholder groups and making specific presentations that are relative to those groups. And so even though he did District C just a couple of weeks ago, we asked and he volunteered to come and do come into the Lion's Den, perhaps, Steve, tonight to speak specifically to East Norwalk. And I think everyone maybe knows who you are, but if you just want to do a brief introduction and then we can get started.
Sure. If you don't know me, my name is Steve Kleppin. I'm the Planning and Zoning Director with the city. I've been here going on 7 years now. So what we're going to talk about tonight is something that I kind of figured we needed to do shortly after I got here, which is update the city's zoning regulations, and kind of overview of what we're going to go tonight, the purpose, intent, and goals of what we're trying to achieve with the rewrite, and focus more so on changes to your guys' immediate surrounds, and then the process and next steps of where we go from here. So as I mentioned, when I first got here, having started looking at the zoning regulations, obviously there's new terminology, new code from previous employment, but it was pretty easy to figure out that the existing zoning regulations were kind of a mess and are kind of a mess. They're not structured very well. If you don't really know how to work with them, you wouldn't know that you need to look in 3 different sections, for example, for maybe something to do with parking or with signage. And it was kind of done as a piecemeal approach and reactionary approach to if and when development projects would come forward. They would typically tweak the regulations at that time. So, taking a look at that and from a structural standpoint makes sense. Right now, there are 31 different zones, including 31 different zones, including 5 single family zones. So we're proposing to take that down to 14 base zones plus what are called overlay zones, which I can go over those a little bit later, with the idea just, the end goal to make the overall regulations easier and simpler to use for the public and for private property owners. Obviously, if you look at it, it could be a little bit daunting when you first look at it because it's such a change from where we are now. But I think over time, as people get more familiar with it, it should be an easier document to go through. So the map on the left is the existing zoning map for the whole city. And what I've highlighted with the circle there is all the different zones that we have. And you can see from the color palette, especially zooming in on the right, and that's just one little stretch of Main Ave on the picture on the right, you can see just all the different kinds of zones all within a really short area. So you go from industrial to commercial to single family to multifamily to 2-family to multifamily back to single family. And there's no rhyme or reason for why a lot of this was put together the way it is. So we wanted to simplify it and come up with a more consistent pattern, which will just make it easier and should make the city develop in a more cohesive pattern over time. Another key reason why we did this was we redid the Plan of Conservation and Development, known as the Citywide Plan, in 2019. So a good practice once that plan is adopted is to update the zoning to, coincide, by and large with the future land use map, which is one of the key recommendations within the POCD. And the POCD itself also says, look, your zoning regulations are kind of a mess. You need to take a look at those and modernize them, make them more cohesive. And some other things that we really focus on is looking at developing near our mass transit infrastructure and our employment centers. And it also recommends looking at a form-based code or a hybrid model, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. So in terms of where we concentrate our development, the main areas kind of working north to south is the Merit 7 area, and there was a large redevelopment approved on the west side of Glover Avenue about a year and a half ago. And then there are 2, I'd say kind of the main area within the city is the South Norwalk area, and then moving northward up West Avenue into Wall Street. That's kind of where the city's kind of focus its main crux of development. So one of the recommendations is to consolidate that area into a single zone, since there's a lot of similarity within the regulations right now. A couple of secondary areas, one we've talked quite a bit about is the area East Norwalk in and around the train station, focusing on East Avenue. And the other one is the Route 1 corridor, which I think one thing I've kind of harped on a lot since I've been here is the Route 1 corridor is just, it's not pedestrian friendly to say the least. Aesthetically, it's a mess. Traffic-wise, it's a mess. And a lot of the reasons why it's become that way is because we've let it become that way. It doesn't have to be that way. So we think the new code over time, and when I'm saying time in this context, it's, it could be 20, 30 years as these properties redevelop. but the idea would be to get a more unified development pattern along that entire stretch. So what is a hybrid code and what's form-based code? So right now, our zoning regulations are what's called Euclidean zoning, and that stems from a long ago court case where it was Euclid versus Ambler Realty, which allowed communities to separate uses by what they are. So that kind of the classic example would be to prevent me from putting in a slaughterhouse next to your single family house. So that way there's some separation of uses and preservation of property values, as well as preservation of integrity of the different areas of a community. There's been more thinking and more modernization in terms of what's called a form-based code. And the form-based code really focuses less on use. It doesn't discount use by any stretch of the imagination, but use isn't the predominant reason for what how you factor in where you develop in the city. The form-based code looks more at the massing of the building. It looks at the relationship between the street and the building and the pedestrian experience of the building. So what you're actually sensing and seeing and feeling versus what's actually going on inside the building. This form-based code also relies heavily on graphics and tables to help illustrate what you're trying to achieve. And our regulations, what we've proposed, are really a hybrid. So in the traditional single-family neighborhoods, AA, AAA, those really aren't vastly impacted by these changes. So we've kept that same kind of model for the most part, just kind of updated some of the things that needed updating. Where the form-based really comes into play is in the commercial areas and the multifamily areas. So the form-based code is built on what's called a transect model. And this is not the full spectrum of a transect, but it gives you a sense of what's going on. So CD is the consultant that we use, which is TPUDC. They have CD, and for Norwalk, CD stands for Community District. We don't have any CD1 in Norwalk. CD1, think of you're in the middle of Montana and you have a 100-acre horse ranch, that might be CD1, where CD2 is kind of the next step down, still a pretty rural area. And the CD3 areas is really what kind of focuses on Norwalk, as well as the CD4 and CD5. There is a CD6, but that's a really dense urban environment, what you might see in New York City, for example. And we also have things called special districts, which are like the hospital zone, our industrial zones. And what's not shown here is what we have a new zone called the civic zone, which looks to get, put regulations in place for governmental properties. It could be state, city, or could even be a taxing district property, which allows them more flexibility than the current regulations might have. For example, we had a school approved, it was in a AAA zone, and because of the wording in the zone, they had to have a setback of 120 feet, which was really cumbersome on the project and really caused a lot of delay and extra time and cost. So the idea with the civic zone is it gives the city more flexibility on its own property, but still provides safeguards and protections for areas in and around residential areas, because you don't want anything the city does to overwhelm anything else in the neighborhood. Some other guiding factors into why we came up with the scheme we came up with. We are in a pretty significant housing crisis in the country, and Fairfield County is kind of a poster child for that. There's just not enough inventory. Everything that gets built gets occupied very quickly. There's not a lot of housing choice overall in some areas, and the price is just astronomical. So we live in an area that not only has a very tight housing market in terms of supply, but also is one of the most expensive areas in the country to live. So the regulations tried to provide some areas for some different housing choice and home ownership opportunities, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about tonight in terms of where some of the proposed two-family zones could go. Some other factors that we've looked at is climate change, which gets reflected in some of the sustainability aspects of the regulations. We think this overall, the form-based code is definitely a way to improve the permitting process, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And also kind of tries to rectify and clear up some of the, what's the private sector's responsibility versus what the public's responsibility is in terms of infrastructure and development. So this is example of what the regulations look like. Every section is kind of set up the same. So the first page, which is the page on the left, is kind of the preamble. So this zone that you're seeing here is the CD3 zone, and the CD3 zone allows either one or two family. It just depends on what the preference is for that particular property. Something else, and I know you can't see this, and I'm happy to pull it up later and enlarge it because I'm just trying to fit it all on one screen. There, I mentioned that the form-based code doesn't focus on use, but it doesn't ignore it either. There is a table now, and what you can see at the top, hopefully you can at least read that where it says principal use. Those are follows the column on the left-hand side, where the right-hand side is all the different zones in the city. That's so that across the right, this is every zone. And on the left are the columns with all the different uses. And there's got to be 15 pages of the different uses. The first page I'm showing you here, just as an example, are some of the residential zone uses. And there's four categories of, actually five, but four main categories in the table. The first one is the easy one, that's P, and that means it's permitted in the zone. So for example, if you're in the CD3 zone or the CD3L zone and you wanted to put up a single family house, that's permitted. So that has a P next to it. If you're in that same zone and you wanted to do a mixed use residential building, that table is going to tell you NP. That means you can't do it. There's also PL. So PL, it means it's permitted with limitations, and the limitations are spelled out at the end of the table. They're in alphabetical order. So each one of these uses that has a PL, so dormitory, for example, has, bad example. Group home, for example, has a PL. So what you would do at the end of that table is find group home in alphabetical order, and it would tell you what the restrictions are about group homes in the zones where it has limitations. And the other category, other category is SPU, and that means it's a special permit use within that zone. And that's kind of standard to what we do now. Another nice thing, which I'm not going to get into in great detail, is all these terms on the left, they all have definitions in the back, which is article, I think it's 9. I think it's 9 or 10. So I apologize. I can't remember which one it is. But the current regulations are really lacking definitions, which has led to a lot of issues over the years. So that was one thing we really stressed with the consultants. We want to define everything. So that way it's clear. That way there's not any misunderstanding about what we're actually saying and referring to. Another nice feature of the form-based code is it defines the building typology and provides examples of what we're actually talking about. And on the right-hand side, it tells you, like, for example, here's a duplex, and it gives a kind of overall, like a definition, a description of what a duplex is. And on the right-hand side, it tells you what zones those duplexes can go in. On the next kind of pages after that, the overall chart of the building types is kind of a zoom in or a little bit of a blow up on those building types. So here's the duplex again, and it gives a little bit better description of what it is. Again, it tells you what zones it can be in, and then some of the standards that go along with that type of building. And yet again, each zone has the very specific standards in terms of how tall the building can be, where the building can be located on the property, how much of the building can take up the property. And so that's all regulated within each zoning district. So now let's talk a little bit more about some changes that are relevant to East Norwalk, and probably what you want to focus your conversation and questions on about tonight. So East Norwalk, and specifically, the areas that we've talked about a lot in the past, there's a kind of a wide variety of land uses. It runs the gambit from industrial to single family. You have municipal uses within that area, whether it's the transfer station or the WPCA, you have parks. So pretty much, I think every classification is in your area. So it's kind of everything falls under that massive umbrella. We went through a lot of changes with the industrial zones about a year to a year and a half ago. There really are no changes to what was approved as part of that rewrite. A couple of the things I know we're going to spend some time talking about. With the, I know not everybody was crazy about the changes to the East Norwalk TOD zone, particularly along the East Avenue corridor. One change that happened as part of the rewrite was we combined two different zones as part of the simplification process. We combined the neighborhood business zone with the existing D residence zone, which is a multifamily. Both of them were very similar in what you could do. The D residence zone had some allowed other uses, but by and large was a residential multifamily zone, where the NB zone was kind of a catch-all zone where you could do some commercial and some residential. They both have the same underlying allowed density, but the combined zone, we went with the higher building height because we felt it was just more appropriate. And to be honest with you, I just think that the 10 feet of height's not much and is not really noticeable most of the time. And the idea too is with the areas that were in the D residence zone, the new zone allows for small scale commercial, typically on the size of 2,500 square feet or less. And those could be things like corner stores, a small restaurant, a gym, a small service industry, or small office, but it's on a very smaller scale. We also expanded the EVTZ a little bit more. We squared it off on Van Zandt Street, and that there were a couple consolidations around the smaller CD4 zone, which is the smaller multifamily zone. One area we've been having a lot of conversation pretty much everywhere we've been out so far, and Brian Baker and myself have been kind of splitting duties on talking to group folks. Brian's actually hosting a meeting right now down with Village Creek folks down in that area. So he's having probably similar conversations. We consolidated so right now I mentioned Norwalk's got 5 single family zones. You have AAA, AA, single A, and B. And those correspond to basically lot size and lot width. And we also have a C zone, which is a 1 or a 2 family zone. So the B zone, which is the smallest single family lot zone, which I think has a lot area of 6,250 square feet, about half of that zone we recommend to split into the new CD3 zone, which is the 1 or 2 family zone, or it got moved into the strictly 1 family zone. And that was just based on a few factors, typically proximity to transit, infrastructure, employment centers. We tried to provide like a gradation model from those areas. So for example, if you're near the South Norwalk train station, that's where your most dense development is. And that's our CD5 zone, which allows 1 unit for every 500 square feet. But then when you get a quarter mile away from that, then you drop to that CD4 zone, which allows a lot less density and lower height. And then there's a buffer beyond that for the most part, which allows this CD3 zone, which is the 1 and 2 family zone. And then when you get, obviously beyond that, then it's strictly a single family zone. If Norwalk was developed and was shaped like a circle, it would be much easier to implement this, but Norwalk's kind of developed like a cross based on where our major access routes are. So we've kind of tried to adopt it to those routes as well. One thing we think is a strong selling point for the CD3 zone is that it provides the opportunity for home ownership. I'm not going to make the claim that it will, but it can do that, because if it's a duplex, you have 2 units, and each one of those units can be different ownership versus the ADU. And if you don't know what an ADU is, that's an accessory dwelling unit. And that's some regulations that the city's had on the books since the 80s. We modified them last year to, the state had been pushing some as of right ADU legislation. Norwalk chose to opt out and adopted something that we felt made a little more sense for the city, but still provided a little more flexibility than the current regulations provided. So we went that route. And I think a couple of things that are pretty significant based on some conversations we've been having. A new 2 family will have more uniform design than a single family with a detached or an attached ADU. And that's just based on what the form-based code requires. And if you put in parking with a new two-family development, those parking spaces, which are 4 that are required, those have to be at the rear or the side of the building, and they have to be zoning compliant spaces. Where I know people talk about, and I know it's a hot topic in East Norwalk, it was going back when we started the discussions about rezoning a few years ago, was it's tough to regulate parking and how many cars somebody has on a property, especially, the way the family dynamics have changed now, where you have multiple generations sometimes living at home. And a lot of times people have multiple automobiles. And if it's a house that was built in the 50s and maybe it has 1, maybe 2 compliant spaces, now if you did redevelop that and make it into a 2-family, you would have to provide 4. So you would be technically, I think, increasing compliance at that point. Looking at some of the specific map changes, and this is kind of starting, I'd say more or less on the northeast quadrant of where your area is. There are some areas, and I know we've had conversations in different parts of the area about, did we go too far with some of the expansion of the single family into the 2-family? And I think in a few areas, we're actually talking about bringing it back just based on some feedback and then doing a little further analysis. So nothing here is set in stone. I think there'll definitely will be adjustments going forward. So I don't want to, hopefully we can have just a good conversation about it tonight and not get too excited. But there, the quirky thing with like the areas kind of like, I'd say east of City Hall and a little bit southeast of City Hall, you've kind of go in certain spots from 1-family to 2-family back to 1-family again. So we try to consolidate and group those areas together. And this is kind of a good illustration of what we were talking about here. So Strawberry Hill here is, I think Vanderbilt runs up through here as well. So the B zone, the map on the right is the existing zoning. And I just took a little snippets, and I have a few of these to go through with you. The B zoning, as I mentioned, single family. The C right now is 1 or 2, and then you go back to single. A is single family as well. So there's kind of like a lot of broken up components to it. So we have proposed to further consolidate that. And a lot of it was based on the distance from the East Ave corridor to this area. And again, I said, nothing here is set in stone, and we're happy to continue the conversation about some of these different areas, but we've consolidated. The map on the left is the proposed zoning. So this area through here goes in the draft zoning map from the B zone to the new CD3, which is the 1 and 2 family. One thing I neglected to mention was there are the existing C zone and the B zone are very similar in terms of the requirements. Both of them have a 50-foot lot width requirement. The B zone is 5,000 square feet, whereas the C zone, to do a 2-family, you need that 6,250, but that same lot width. So otherwise, the characteristics of the lots are very similar. And you can see, Raymond Street, for example, these lots are pretty tight. They're not big lots, so they kind of line up with what we see in other areas for the 2-family zones. What we've seen over time, and there are certain areas of the city that have been zoned 1 or 2 family for, well on close to 100 years now, is less than 50% of those lots, even when they had the ability to become a 2-family, have become a 2-family. And I think the main crux of that is the market has dictated that's what that area wants, and that's the most value. So I think even if areas change from the 1 to potentially 1 or 2, if and when change occurs, it's going to happen very incrementally over a long period of time. And I think that the market's really going to dictate what is more appropriate for those areas versus the key thing is, we're not telling you have to do a 2-family. We're giving the opportunity to do so if that's what the property owner wants. A little bit to the west of there, again, the map on the left is the proposed, where the map on the right is the existing. And I mentioned, I'll repeat it. I apologize if I'm repeating, but it's probably good because we're looking at a lot of different nomenclature. But the C zone on the current map is 1 or 2 family, and this is along north-south along Osborne Ave. So we kind of, that's all remained the same. There's a little bit of pocket of this B zone up here that we propose to put into the 1 or 2 family zone. And then there are some changes on the southern portion, kind of south of the railroad tracks, which we should probably go over a little bit here. Along Seaview Avenue, it's kind of a mishmash of zoning right now. It's got a lot of multifamily, even though they're not all multifamily. It's got 2 family on the east or the right side, which is over here. And then this is that neighborhood business. Excuse me, I'm sorry. This is the neighborhood business, this kind of pinkish color here, which is that NB. So the proposal is to consolidate the zoning through that stretch and put it into a zone we haven't talked about yet, which is CD4W. And what I really like about the CD4W zone is it's actually a lower height than the other zones, with the idea being that we wanted to, which we talked about a lot with the TOD plan, was making sure the areas around Seaview and First Street, Second Street, kind of really where those areas that are kind of like the iconic areas in East Norwalk, as well as Liberty Square, get, I'm not going to use the term preserve, but kind of not incentivizing anything different on those properties. We want to, see those kind of those areas remain and strengthened if and when at all possible. Going further south, so again, existing map on the right, this large red swath, sort of reddish swash here, that's the C family, which is the existing 1 or 2 family zone. We've added this small area of Seaside Place because it was kind of a little bit cut off, as proposed to go into the 1 or 2 family zone. And the further south, a little closer to the water, there is a consolidation of single family zones, but it remains single family. You can just see it's a unified color. One thing which we didn't talk about, but it's worth mentioning here, with the consolidation of single family zones that are going to remain single family zones, we're no longer regulating the lot area. So the metric that we're really measuring what's there is the width of the lot. So a lot of these lots have the similar requirements in terms of how much width they can have on the street. And we're also going to require that they have a lot circle of that same width. So if the lot width requirement on the street, and again, that's just basically your property line side to side and how much of the city street you abut, if that makes sense, hopefully. So that metric really is what people perceive. People really can't perceive how big a parcel is unless you get like an aerial view. You really don't know, if you're driving by or walking by, for the most part, how deep somebody's lot is. You wouldn't know that unless you were looking, treetop levels or, aerial view level down. So the good thing is, if these lots have the same widths, there's not going to be this big fruition of subdivision applications, because the other factor is with the lot width requirement, you're no longer going to have rear lots. So right now, somebody could have done a 25-foot access way if they had the required width plus an additional 25 feet. That ability no longer exists. So the only place I think in the city which might see some additional lots as a result of this, and I don't think it's very many at all, I think is going to be in like what's right now our AAA zone, which is, there's some in East Norwalk, but more of it is up north of the Merritt Parkway. And I think the only time that's going to really come into play is if somebody's got a corner lot, which is, they're on 2 different street fronts and they have a lot of width on both those streets. But I don't think it's going to lead to much of a proliferation of additional lots. And I actually have somebody doing some analysis now, because we're just want to double check and make sure what we're saying is actually factual. So this is kind of like my last slide, and I'm happy to take as many questions as you have. So as Diane mentioned earlier, we've been doing different meetings through the council districts, some better attended than others. The next council meeting, which is actually the last one, is May 24th at the Norwalk Library, and that's for District A. We're doing a lot of these different community meetings. We've done 3 or 4 already. Like I mentioned, we're doing this one and another one as well tonight. And I have some smaller meetings set up this week And probably we have at least another half dozen total meetings to go through, as well as meetings with board commissions from like harbor management, zoning board of appeals. We did a brief overview with ECD members already, and we're going to continue to talk to them. And if full council wants us to meet with them, we'll do that as well. The Planning and Zoning Commission has scheduled 2 public hearings to get feedback. They're not adoption hearings, so please don't panic and think we're doing something next month. We're not. Those are on the 21st and the 28th. It's just an idea to hear what people say so far. And I think at one of those sessions, we're actually going to hopefully do a sustainability roundtable with some different consultants and folks we've talked to, because the commission is very eager to introduce sustainability requirements into the regulations. But I don't think everybody's got a great handle on what all those impacts are. So we really want to bring in some experts to talk about it before we codify and then adopt anything. So what will happen is over July and August, the commission will kind of digest everything they've heard, whether it's in person or written comment, and as well as, all the comments we've received to date. And they'll have to make a decision on what they think merits inclusion or what should be deleted. And then we're looking at holding an additional hearing at the end of September towards adopting the regulations, and probably targeting an effective date of January 1st of 2024 for the new regulations to be in effect. And the reason why we did that is because we're going to need a month or so to put the edits into the new documents that we finally adopt. And, there are going to be some property owners that probably will have been holding off on doing some things, and would, in all, trying to be as fair as possible, give them a month or so to decide whether they want to wait to do their project, or will they feel they're perhaps better off under the existing zoning regulations. I think we might see some subdivision applications on those rear lots. I think people might say, hey, wait a minute, I might lose this ability under the new regs, so I might as well go for it now. So I do anticipate some of those coming up. I think that is it. Diane, did you want me to pull up the website stuff? Which I can do.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, why don't you do that now, Steve, so people can jot it down so they know where to go right after this, and then we'll open that up for questions and comments as well.
Okay.
And then if you have other maps, maybe that you can bring up as well. If people are asking questions, maybe we can hone in on the specific area.
Yeah, I'll walk you through the webpage first, and then I can go right into the map from there, if that's okay.
And also, we thanks for getting the icon up. If you can remind people now that the icon to get to the page with one click is now on the front page of the city website. Maybe we can show them where that is.
Sure.
And this way it cuts down on the bunch of clicks to get there.
So here's the city's homepage. So as Diane mentioned, there isn't a button that takes you right here. So just click on that. If it's pretty simple. Otherwise, you can go on the city's webpage and just go to city government and then go to planning zoning, and that's our landing page. And then there's a tab on the left, zoning regulations update. This gives kind of a description of why we're doing what we're doing. And a lot of these sheets on here, I think, will answer a lot of questions that people have been asking. The first one is, what is form-based code and why are we doing this? There's another one on the differences between the bulk and height standards from the existing to the proposed. The outreach schedule is the one I talked about before I got into my presentation. This should be updated hopefully tomorrow, which will include with the links to the Zoom meetings so far. And there were a couple meetings where there were recording issues. So in that absence, we'll have the PowerPoint presentation from those meetings, as well as the prior meetings that the commission held with the consultant team. And there's information on this one. It talks about the changes with the zoning map and why, changes to the flood hazard zone, changes to the Coastal Area Management Act, or CAM, a section on sustainability. And one thing I think people will really like is there's a whole new section on grading, drainage, and vegetation. So if you've ever lived next to somebody who bought a piece of property and they knocked their house down with the intent of building a new house, what typically happens is they tend to alter the grade quite a bit. So they'll bring in fill, mound up the grade, and then usually what results is runoff onto a neighbor's property. So we now have standards in place that will prevent that and really regulate that, which I think will be a big plus going forward. Right below that is how you can provide input to us. So in addition to emailing myself or Brian, which is, fine and very simple to do, you can also click out over here or over here, and it takes you to a feedback page. And it kind of, first question is kind of just a quick, hey, who are you? Asking for just to help us with a little bit of information. Next one is what is the area you have questions or concerns with? And that articles all correspond to the different chapters of the regulations. And then here you can provide your comment as it pertains to that particular section. Right below that is at the actual regulations. The bottom right tab is the whole set of regulations by itself. So you can click on that. It'll open up the whole document. It's a really big document. So it might be easier to maneuver around the different sections. Article 4 is probably the one people are going to pay the most attention to. And that's the one we spend a little bit of time on talking about the different zoning districts and what they all mean. And below that are the draft zoning maps. So the one on the left is a typical static PDF map, and you can zoom in and try to find your property. But what we've done, which I think is pretty helpful, is put together this interactive zoning map. So you have to put in your property address and it'll tell you what the zone is. But first it's going to just pop up a little disclaimer, just say, I've read all this and I understand this. Does somebody want to volunteer a property? Or I can use City Hall if you'd like.
Do something like in East Norwalk, do like, I don't know, something on East Avenue.
Yeah. All right, I'll try. I don't know what all the numbers are, so.
Or do like, 200 or East Avenue.
One important thing to remember when you're putting this in, and we're luckily here, it popped right up, but this database is a GIS database, so it's a national database. So you might see addresses from Norwalk, California, Darien. So just be careful that you actually click on the Norwalk, Connecticut property, because I've done that. And so you don't want to do that. So this is 200 East Avenue. So it can here's where that property is. Just click on the property right next to it. And it's going to, it tells you here, what pops up is existing zoning. So this properties in the EVTZ. Here's the link to the existing zoning. I'm not going to click on all these, and the schedule of what the standards are for that zone. Next to this is a little arrow. You click on that. This zone is actually an overlay zone. So there's a second tab typically there's only 2 tabs, but this one has 3. So this tells you a little bit more of what the actual overlay zone regulations are for this zone. And then the third tab, which is going to look a lot like that because the zone didn't change, but it's it did change. It's the overlay didn't change, but it's now in what's called the CD4 zone. So you would click on that and it's going to open up the CD4 zone regulations. And that is a little bit similar to what we looked at with the CD3 zone. So you just scroll down and it tells you all the standards. And the other thing it tells you is it takes you to the use table. So this is I can zoom in now to give you a little bit better idea what I was talking about before. The first page just tells you how to use the use table. And then this just kind of zooms in on the use table. So I mentioned duplexes before. Up across on the left is the column with all the different uses and this happens to be residential. There's commercial, industrial, retail, I'm sure service related. And across the right are all the different zones. So these are all the zones of the city. And this kind of matrix just kind of tells you, where those are at in terms of what's allowed. I think that explains how to get to the map. Do you want me to leave the interactive map up? Or do you want me to go to the slides I had?
Yeah, maybe do that and then just hit like Raymond Terrace or something. So we see a zone that's actually changing from one to another. And it's within residential. So we can see the change from one family B to two family CD, CD3.
Okay, so this is, it's not telling me what property. Yeah, so that one trick, I can't zoom in quick. Let me see if I can zoom in a little more.
If
I
you go
can see
down
this.
around Cloverly, I think you may find an example there where it switches from one to the other, like between Cloverly and Emerson. So
I think this switches too. I
Yeah,
think
this switches too.
yeah, I'm just trying to get, it's a little bit hard to see with the color, but
Yeah. That's okay.
street,
Just click on
Yeah.
any one. It's a
the street
residential
number is
parcel.
here if you can't quite make it out. This is like the property ID number, but the street number is actually right there. If I zoomed in, I would tell you, but if you click on the property, this one, so it's proposing to go into the new CD3 zone. And then if you clicked over, it will let me click over. Right now it's in the B residence zone. So that's a one family zone. And then it tells you here's, if you click on this, it's going to take you to the entire residential zoning section. And then, but this is the schedule that pertains to the single family zoning as well. Do you want me to open up any of these? I can do whatever you'd like.
I think go to the proposed one, I think, from there so people can see what the change is, because it's actually, unless you know the zone you're in and you don't want to read all those pages, it could be okay. So essentially then what Steve is showing you is a parcel on Raymond Terrace somewhere that's zoned right now for single family, and the proposal is to change over to CD3, which is one or two family.
And some of the stuff you're going to see here is very similar to what we have in our current regulations, which is pretty standard stuff like the front setback, the side setback, rear setback. And one other thing we're not doing that, or we're doing differently than we currently do. Right now, we regulate something that called lot coverage, which is basically a percentage the building can occupy on a property. So it basically looks at like a top-down view of the footprint of the building in relation to how big the lot is. What we're doing now is regulating what's called impervious surface, and that regulates not only the building, but it regulates the walkway and the driveway. So you can't, the idea being, we don't want you to just pave your entire property, because that just leads to increased heat as well as increased runoff. So it's a way to like regulate water filtration into the property versus, spilling out. And I can scroll
and
down.
Steve, what you're saying with this cutover to, if someone were to do two family, then no matter what configuration they try to do that in, they would be required to have 4 parking spaces.
Correct.
On the side or the rear of the property.
Correct. Yeah, and we have I don't know if it's as important for this group or not. We did put a provision in we get a lot of complaints about parking in the front setback. So one thing we added a regulation in it, like if somebody's not, say you're just you need to have more parking or you have a problem, you can add a parking space in your front yard now, but we've regulated what that can look like, how it has to be screened, what the material is, because that's a big problem, but it's not as relevant to what we're talking about at the moment.
Okay, and I think before you go into the questions, because I think a lot will be residential, there are big chunks, and there's kind of actually like a cutout of where you leave the single family intact, but you're doing the two family around it if you come south in East Norwalk. But I see Judy has her hand up, and I think I have the same question, but I'll let her jump in here when we take the questions. There was at least one parcel in East Norwalk proper, maybe 2, that you have tagged as to be determined.
Oh, yeah.
So we just want to understand what those are, because it makes us a little nervous, but we also want to understand the Norton parcel itself after you look at what this situation is here.
Yeah,
in East
so
Norwalk.
Yeah, and I'll hit those two really quickly. The TBD is, it really relates to some waterfront parcels because we've been having ongoing conversations with the ECD Committee of Common Council. And they had some questions and concerns about specific areas, and the areas most concerned are really out of your boundary. There were around the waterfront parcels along Commerce Street and along Water Street. So there's been a lot of concern about what they're going to be zoned for going forward. There's a lot of different viewpoints on that and a lot of strong opinions. So we're trying to, I think before this gets, ultimately before it's voted on, that'll be decided. Norden itself, it's currently I-2, proposed for I-2. The city did put money in the capital budget to kind of look at land use and maybe come up with some other ideas for land use for that area. So those funds should be available July 1 for us to take a look at that. I have been having ongoing conversations with the property owner about things. So I think I don't think they're overly thrilled with some of the changes we made too. So they have some ideas. So maybe something gets worked out there in the interim. Can you guys see the map? Because I switched tabs. So I didn't know if it switched the.
Yeah, we do. We're not saying Norden, but we see the map. But if you can go down a little bit more south though too, Steve, so that we can see that big chunk where the two-family is excluded.
Did you tell me?
Yeah.
Am I going the right direction?
So so you're coming down, keep going. Okay, yep. So then you said that you cut off here at Alden. You may need to go back up a little bit or zoom out.
Yeah, it's just got to load a second. It's just a big map.
Because some of it appears to be arbitrary, but I think what you're going to hear tonight is a concern about the switch over to two-family within the entire transit district. So
it'll load in a second, but I can tell you from memory that this area right now is 1 or 2 family. There we go. So for example, let me zoom in and I'll click on a parcel.
Oh, okay. I thought that was B zone.
No, give me a sec here.
Okay.
I think you had a PowerPoint that showed that area side by side.
Yeah, I can switch to that if that's easier.
Yeah, maybe we need to do that. So let's open this up for questions so we can get some folks in here. Scott is co-piloting. So, one of the things that's difficult, I think, is that we can't always see who has their hand raised up in order, but I know Judy has had her hand up. So
yeah, I was going to say,
okay.
Regardless, Judy has a few things in chat and she's had her hand up for a while. So let's let her unload.
Unmute. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Judy.
Good. Steve, way back in your presentation, you listed a whole bunch of things. I think you called them Area 1, which was related to Sono, West Avenue, Wall Street, Route 1. You were sort of lumping a bunch of stuff together. The Merit 7 area, Wall Street, West Avenue, and then you lumped East Norwalk in there. And I'm just personally having difficulty sort of understanding what East Norwalk has in common with Route 1, Merit 7, West Avenue, Wall Street. I didn't see Rowayton in there. Because I know there's a complaint from the Rowayton residents about how their little downtown area has become built up with all these tall commercial / other structures. And I'm just curious how East Norwalk sort of got lumped in with those huge, definite commercially centered areas. I mean, Merit 7, Route 1, and West Avenue and East Avenue, Main Street, Wall Street, they have nothing to do in common that I can visually see with those other areas, which are, heavily built up. I'm just wondering why that they were lumped in together, why we were lumped in with that. Is it because the East Avenue has some business off of it, like a restaurant, you know, a couple of gas stations? And I mean, can you explain that a little? That's my main question.
And then Norton.
Yeah.
Sure.
No,
So,
Norton, Diane addressed.
All right,
So
cool.
that I withdraw anything related to Norton. That's my main question. Why is East Norwalk within the
so as I mentioned earlier, that the city's, the main areas of development focus that, and there's three, but we're kind of merging two of them now with the new zoning. The three would be the Merit 7 train station, you know, where the office towers and the redevelopment, and this sector up through here. So that's area 1. Areas 2 and 3, and these are the main areas. So the second area, which I didn't really circle through here, but it's the West Ave Wall Street corridor. And then the third one is the South Norwalk train station area, the TOD area. So from kind of like the Route 1 corridor north of Wall Street, south to where the TOD area was rezoned 5-6 years ago now. That's kind of one area now. And then two areas that I would call minor, or areas that we focus less attention, not less attention, but less development focus on, would be East Norwalk and then the Route 1 corridor. So I would say now two main areas, again, just to repeat so there's no misunderstanding. One is the Merit 7 area. Second is kind of the city's urban core, which runs from South Norwalk up towards just north of Wall Street. So those are the two areas. And the two I would call secondary areas are East Norwalk and then the Route 1 corridor. And I understand, you know, this came up at the, you know, the District C meeting we had about, you know, Row 8 and why Row 8 and not East Norwalk, or reverse that, why East Norwalk and not Row 8. And, you know, and honestly, I think we talked last week, we were at 6th Taxing District meeting. We talked to them, we you know, staff would recommend that in proximity to the train station, there are a couple streets where it would make sense to go to the CD3, which is that 2-family zoning. You know, their train station's not right where their village is, not where their commercial corridor is. It's north of that. It's just kind of a strange spot why it was put there in the first place, but that's where it is. So we would, you know, staff is talking to them and will continue to advocate for that CD3 zoning in and around their train station.
Thanks, Judy. Scott, do we have other hands up?
Yeah. Next up, not a hand, but I think Michael Pavlison, if I'm pronouncing your last name right, if you want to unmute yourself, I think you had some questions in the chat, including one about increasing ownership opportunities.
Yes, hi, this is Michael. I don't understand your definition, zoning's definition of duplex. As a real estate broker, we would say 2-family, or a duplex would be a side-by-side dwelling. So I just need you to explain, you know, what that does to increase homeownership opportunities without it being called 2 condos. A single 2-family home would be one owner, possibly owner occupied, probably investor owned. So you'd have 2 transient, you know, tenant occupied dwellings, or, you know, units. If you could answer that.
Sure. So zoning doesn't get into home ownership. We can't regulate home ownership. So we always talk in terms of 1-family, 2-family, and then for us, multifamily is 3 or more. So by allowing, you can call it a duplex or a 2-family within that CD3, those can be condominiumized and potentially could have different owners. So it's a lot cheaper for somebody to purchase a single unit of a 2-family versus buying a single-family house, for example.
All right, that's does increase the density of a neighborhood dramatically. So the question I had too was, if you're now requiring 4 parking spaces beyond the frontage of the house, the dwelling, it would seem to me that that's pretty easily done by paving in a backyard. Not an attractive thing, and an impervious surface as well. But then later you mentioned something about you've lightened up the requirements for parking to be beyond the frontage, the front of the house. That they might allow parking spaces in the front yard with appropriate screening, that kind of thing. Can you explain that? I did not see that in what I looked at online.
Yeah, so to clarify, that wouldn't be permitted so if somebody was doing a new 2-family, for example, you couldn't do the parking in the front yard. That's only meant to deal with existing properties, and they're not renovating or not building a new 2-family, for example. So we are regulating. So right now you can pave your entire backyard, your front yard. There's nothing that necessarily stops you from making your property 100% impervious surface. The new regulations wouldn't allow that. So it would restrict that potential to happen. So somebody might not be able to, even if they wanted to build a 2-family, for example, they might not be able to provide for compliant parking spaces, because each one of those spaces has a dimension. I think it's 9 by 18 or whatever, it's 9 by 19 or whatever it is. So they have to comply with all 4. All 4 of those have to comply, and they can't be in the front yard, which is, a major detractant aesthetically. They have to be in the side or the rear. So if they're not compliant and they can't provide the compliant spaces, then they can't get their 2-family.
All right. I just feel like I've been in enough current C zone, multifamily zones in my lifetime, and none of them look as attractive as a B zone, which is, considered single family. And then even if somebody does pave the backyard, applies, is able to accommodate the 4 parking spaces, there's no requirement that they can't park on the street, obviously. So we do get, the 2 or 3 cars that do fit in the driveway or in the backyard, and then the 1 or 2 perhaps that sit on the street. I don't like the sound of this. I don't like the sound of I don't think I like the way this is going to look. Having bought in a single family zone 30 some years ago, this is what I bought into, single family. I did not buy into 2 families. So I really do have a strong opposition to this. Just want you guys to know.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I should mention too that, not related to this specifically, but the TOD plan did make a recommendation for the city to explore a residential parking permit program for East Norwalk. So I think that's something that could alleviate some of that on-street parking. It's not necessarily tied to the proposed zoning, but we've talked about that internally, and it's something that the city, I think, should take a look at for this area.
All right, thank you.
Hello?
Hey, you're up, Lou.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening. First of all, I'm sorry that I was late to getting to the meeting. I had somewhere else to be. But I wanted to just thank Steve for doing all this work. I think this is a major undertaking by the city. I've been an architect in Norwalk for the past 35 years, and this is the first time I ever seen something like this. And in actuality, I think it's going to do a lot of good as far as finding information and be able to find zoning regulations instead of going to all these different pages and all the different types of charts. So I think the PNC is definitely doing a wonderful job with this. I have a couple of questions. One is when you're doing this coverage, no longer just going to be done by impervious areas. Is this something that's going to have to be done by a civil engineer, or is going to be who's going to be in charge of producing that information for review?
Similar to and like I said, if someone's going to build a new house today, they have to provide an A2 survey, and the A2 survey has a coverage calculation on it. It would be the same thing with it might take a little more coordination between the architect, engineer and surveyor to make sure everybody's looked at the same set of plans, because otherwise, at the end of the day, the surveyor is going to have to give us an as-built survey that shows what was, excuse me, what was actually constructed on the property versus what they proposed. So you have to make sure what was built at the end of the day complies.
What about having to do calculation for around rain, storm runoff? Is that going to be something that's going to be also required?
Yeah, that's required now. Sorry, I took my screen share off. I can put it back up if you need it. Yeah, that's required now with the city's drainage manual. They do ask you to provide calculations of runoff to make sure there's no net runoff. The regulations, the tricky thing is that like Public Works, their engineering folks do that review now, but they don't have as much teeth as like the zoning regulations would. So now the new regulations kind of codify and we're the P&Z staff is kind of the enforcement end of that, where the DPW engineers are the technical reviewer of those kind of documents. So they have the expertise in terms of civil site work, where we can make sure what's proposed actually complies.
Okay, when doing these impervious calculations, what if you use gravel or use one of these pavers where the grass can come through it? How is that going to be affected or done?
So I'd have to pull up the definition of impervious surface coverage, because I think it tells you what counts and what doesn't count. So I can do that if you want, or I could email you a different.
But I gather that's going to have people going to start kind of working with that to make sure that in case you're over the coverage over these impervious areas, you might be able to actually have a gravel area if that's not considered impervious, correct?
Potentially, and I don't want to say 100% without going back and reading the definition, but I understand what you're saying.
Okay. I'm sorry, like I say, I came in late, but how is this area going to be impacted as far as in-law apartments? You're still going to be able to do that, correct? In this area, in the zone?
I'm glad you asked, because that's a good question that speaks to the last gentleman talking about the density issue and the concerns. So if your zone, if you're going to be in the new CD3, which is the 1 or 2 family zone, you decide to do a 2-family, you can't also do an ADU on that property. You can stay a single family and do an attached or a detached ADU, but if you do a true 2-family, you can't do an ADU as well. So in our mind, it's really not an increase in density.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty much I have for now. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to go looking through all the regulations. So I was trying to get into the map portion of to the internet, and it seems like I can't be able to log on to the maps for some reason. Maybe just my computer, I'm not sure.
Let me know if you have trouble. I can double check. It should be, I mean, it's pulling from a lot of data, so it might just be slow.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Scott, before we go over to the chat room, I just want to mention something as well. So the process with the city, Steve, has been, I checked the start of this with the consultants, has now been 36 months worth of work. I'm not suggesting that's every day, but this is a massive overhaul, and many of the changes that are within the city impact the whole city. It impacts us as residents, as taxpayers, and quality of life, and there's a lot to digest. So I know that there's a push underway or about to start as well, to say that, with 36 months of work and a lot of detail in here to go through, that it doesn't really seem reasonable from the time that this thing first made the public, access. In fact, the map was withheld, I think, for a couple of weeks. So it's just April 12th since people have seen the actual map. Why wouldn't we be able to have the city not have these public hearings in June? And even for the commission to review stuff in the summer seems kind of non-productive, and just move this out to the fall and possibly even after the election as well.
I mean, that, ultimately that's a decision for the commission to make. I think the timing wise, I mean, as you mentioned, it's tricky to do stuff in July and August. I think in terms of a city initiated action, like, rezoning, we wouldn't, we never contemplated doing it in July and August. I mean, we're a good 6 months behind schedule, and that's my fault. Well, my fault alone. Ideally, we would have been done by now, but it got delayed for a couple of different reasons. One was to do a secondary legal review, which I wish we had, initiated at the beginning, but we didn't. So that kind of delayed things.
Right.
But I think the timing we've laid out now, the hearings are, what are they, 5 to 7 weeks off now. So, and I what we're hearing so far is pretty universal comments about the main areas. I think people are, the going from the 1 to the 2 family has been a pretty consistent conversation piece from, for the areas of the city that's been brought up. And again, the question about, what does it mean if we're no longer regulating the lot area? I think that's less of an issue. To be honest with you, I don't think it really plays out too much, I think, based on what we've seen. And then I think it's a lot of just people just getting familiar with the change. Because I fully admit it, it's just looking at one document next to the other document that, it looks completely different. So I think there's the familiarity aspect of it. And I think doing the hearings this way, the commissions gets the chance, just to hear what people are saying, what their concerns are. And then they have a couple months to think about that, what this all means. My kind of principal goal is to get the zones correct. Where the lines on the map eventually end up is, I know that's very front and center for a lot of people on the call, and I'm not trying to minimize that at all. But I think for me, the lines can be adjusted over time if we decide
I think
not enough two-family, or we need more two-family. You shift the lines, you shift the multifamily lines. I think getting the zones correct is if I thought there was a major problem with the zones and how they're laid out, I'd be worried, but I'm not there.
Okay,
Sorry,
and I think just exactly the opposite would be the sense that we're getting, is that exactly what's happened with the zone in East Norwalk with the switch from single family to 2-family is the primary concern, especially the density now that we've had with the existing TOD and the EVTZ. And so it may even be a question in the room, just so that we can be respectful of people's time, as to what is there a consideration to take that change from B to CD3 out altogether, and leave the single family zones alone? Because if the push is just density, then it's not really going to do anything in terms of home ownership, and I don't really think it addresses anything having to do with affordability, and it puts an additional burden. So if the community came back, and I know we're addressing the 800-pound gorilla in the room now with the comment you made about if thousands of people oppose something, that if you felt it was still right, you would fight for that with the commission to keep it in there.
Yeah.
But is there an opportunity to take this change out from B to CD3?
I would say there are certain areas that we've already staff has looked at and said, yeah, we're going to talk to the commission about taking those out, taking kind of keep in mind that, Norwalk, even with the map as it sits today, is predominantly single family zoning. So it's not like wholesale changes. The overall percent change, or I should say percent decrease of the single family was only 5%. So we're talking a pretty small amount. But I will say there are areas that we've already looked at. We're like, yeah, it probably on first glance is a little too aggressive. So we are going to scale back certain areas. And there are a couple areas in East Norwalk we've already talked about internally. I'm not going to tell you what those are tonight, but I think before the June 21st hearing, we'll discuss that with the commission, and maybe that'll get kind of laid out at the beginning of that process. Maybe we'll ease some people's minds, not everybody. Another thing we're doing internally right now is really digging in on, and I see some little things popping up in the chat on values and those kind of things. So we're digging deep into those. So far from what we've seen, it's not a deterrent or not a detraction at all, but we're going to try to, before we come out and say something definitively on that, we're just going to keep looking at data, and then we'll put something up, probably another information sheet on the two-family change, just so here's our facts, here's our data, please, review this and let us know what you think.
Okay, yep, thanks for that. Because the areas that you seem to be increasing the density in now are the areas that have been targeted for increased density already. And these are small parcels, and they're highly impacted by the quality of life that goes along with density. And big areas of the city have been completely untouched in terms of that. So there's also an inherent inequity here in how we're looking at it, regardless of a presumed link to transit. So okay, back to the chat and the.
In that case, if we're back to the chat, I do see that Deborah's had her hand raised for a bit.
Hi, actually, my husband Frank has a question, and it's regarding the Seaview Avenue area.
Hi, I'm Frank Ross. We live on Seaview Avenue, and I noticed that it's going to be in like a special water district. And you did mention that, this is addressed to Steve, by the way. Thank you for being here. Seaview Avenue is like all residential right now, even though it's like, pretty dense. But I don't see an opportunity for commercial use on this street, or at least I don't think it's a good use to encourage any kind of commercial use. Could you comment on that?
Sure, and I could probably do it later on. I don't know if I can do it on the fly, and go into the zone itself and show you what's permitted and what's not permitted. But the zone itself, the 4W zone, it's similar actually in scale in terms of what you can do today. In some cases, may actually be a little lower scale than what you could do today. It does potentially allow, and I want to check that before I get too far, but I can probably do that while I'm listening to another question about the commercial uses. And I'm not trying to avoid your question. I just don't want to misspeak. But let me jump to another one, and while I'm hopefully multitasking, I can dig that out.
In that case, I see Catherine's got her hand up.
Hello.
Hey, we see you and hear you.
Okay, great. Forgive me, I'm a simple nurse, and I am trying to understand how this is going to be advantageous converting my area, my zone, to two-family. Is there some plus to this that is eluding me at this point? I like your reorganization. Your charts are really nice and making it very cohesive, but other than making, good housekeeping, this is just, I'm not seeing what this is going to personally do for me, unless there's some compensation with decreased property taxes that would offset the potential devaluation of my house.
Yeah, so from what we've seen, we don't think that's going to be the case at all in terms of changing property values. The assessor makes determinations based on what's on the property, not on what the zoning potentially allows. From what we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, I'm sorry I'm being repetitive, but the zones that have been historically 1 and 2 family, for 100 years, less than 50% of those have gone to the 2 family when they could have. So I think what's going to dictate what actually happens on the property is the market. What we're recommending, which we think is good, to hopefully alleviate some of the housing pressures that the area is seeing, and Norwalk is seeing, is provide another avenue. And I mean, I think ENNA at one of the prior meetings had recommended they wanted to see some more two-family housing in the area. So I think, we're targeting in certain areas where it lines up with the existing, in proximity to the existing two-family abilities in those areas. And I think a big selling point, and like, again, I'm not telling you it will happen, but potentially it could lead to someone else having home ownership opportunity where right now they might not be able to do that. So I think those are selling points. I think just because it's being rezoned to 1 or 2 doesn't mean it will, because that's just not been the case where we've seen it in other parts of the city.
So advantageous to someone else, not necessarily for myself.
Well,
Got
I
it.
mean, like if you feel, at some point in time, you wanted to sell your property and obviously at that point you're deciding to move on, regardless. You have the option to sell to somebody who could buy it as a 1, or they could buy it to turn it into a 2. And that would be at that point their choice. If there's more market value in it becoming a 2, then you're going to get a higher price for your property.
Yeah, if it fit within those parameters. Just the simple numbers. I have practical experience with a home across the street from me that was occupied by multiple people, and we had made access and parking rather difficult. Plus, the tricky aspect of my vision is not improving as I'm getting older. I have to be very careful getting out of my driveway for people zipping in, zipping out, back and forth. Where are the cars? Where are the kids? It was a safety issue. So that's going to be further complicated by having multiple family. So if we're talking 2 families, then there's even more cars. But you're saying that you can only have a max of 4, I guess, parking spaces. You have to have 2 parking spaces per family?
2 per unit. So each unit technically, I guess, is a family by definition at that point. So right now you could build today without us doing anything of the regulations. You could add a 1,000 square foot ADU to your property. And there's no limitation on how many people can live inside that ADU. So they could have 3 or 4 cars there. So, and for the ADU, they only have to provide 1 additional parking space. So I could make the counter argument that if you had a 2-family with 4 compliant spaces, you might actually have less cars on the street than you would with a larger ADU.
But they have, I mean, it's not unusual for a single family to have 3 cars. If you've got teenagers and 2 adults, and you already have more cars.
You could, you could do that. 1,000 square foot ADU is really big. Trust me, somebody who started out when my starter home was a small 3-bedroom under 1,000, you could squeeze a lot of people in there. So there's nothing in the current regs that prevent the scenario you're laying out.
Okay, so this is not necessarily going to make it better. It's only advantageous to me if I decide to sell my home, that somebody might consider it a plus if they wanted to make it a 2-family. Okay.
It's options. It's not, it's if we were saying you have to do a 2-family and not allowing 1-families, I think it would definitely be a different conversation.
Hey, Steve, speaking of the ADUs, you're talking about it wouldn't be any greater density there, but the fact of the matter is that, you're talking about the opportunity, the difference is to have potentially the same density, but an opportunity for home ownership. And I think people have kind of already, discussed that to say that that's probably not the likelihood in terms of something that would be a duplex. These properties that could either be converted as a renovation then would likely be, rentals as rental units. Do you, if you're looking at East Norwalk and you're looking at streets like Olmsted and Raymond and some of the others that are very highly dense right now with relatively small parcels. Is what you're thinking that people who want to take advantage of that, would be knockdowns and be rebuilt? Or are you thinking that it's something that would either be added onto in height or going deeper into the property onto the existing house?
I think it could be any of those scenarios. A lot of that, it all depends on what the shape of the existing house is. And, sometimes, we looked at a lot of different streets too, and some of them, it depends on what the existing building is. Some of those are really not conducive to retrofitting and adding a unit on top or something like that. And some of the styles of those units aren't particularly attractive today because, sometimes, my house is a 1950s ranch. To modernize it, you're ended up, you're gutting almost the entire inside of the house. At one point, does it become cheaper to just scrape it and start from new? I think it depends on the house and the neighborhood and what the other houses look like around it. I think part of the problem is that what we think the form-based code will prevent, and we're trying to just double check on our assurances on that, is a lot of the older two families that were built, and I think this is just a habit of the times, I guess, were just basically a box with two doors and had no charm, no character. And I think that's what a lot of people think about when we're talking about adding those duplexes in. So it's basically, I'll put the box in, move away, and it doesn't do anything aesthetically for the neighborhood, where there's a lot of different things with two families where they can look a lot different and blend in and look a lot more attractive. And there's plenty of examples in Norwalk of that as well.
And I just want to clarify something that you said for the audience here with regards to ENNA's longtime support of ADUs, but missing middle housing as well, including the two family. That's in reference to citywide and particularly parcels that are large enough to support it. So where the 1 acre zoning and most of the outlying parcels have been completely excluded from expansion. We're already looking at density here, where again these are smaller parcels. I think East Norwalk, and we can look this up. I believe we're the most highly densely designated neighborhood in the city right now. The other reference to missing middle, duplexes, quadplexes, bungalows, courtyards, etc. Those were supports that we talked about before the as we were doing TOD, and we were talking about East Avenue. Unluckily, and new development, not on existing long-term single-family properties that, that would be impacted by. We were talking about new development and development in the city where parcels are large enough to be able to handle it. Not to suggest that any of our city services can handle any of this, by the way. So that's also something else for people to take into account. Depending just on what the desired or anticipated population growth would be here with that. I'd like to hear the comments that came in. I saw it pop up in chat a couple times about the difference between multifamily and two-family is that the regulations with multifamily don't really allow for inspections and to control the number of families that are living in a two-family house. So if whoever was in chat can speak to that, or if Steve can answer it, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, so just I think I'll try to answer it, I guess. So we define a one family, which is pretty clear, two family, which is pretty clear, and for us, multi is three or more. Three or more, they are subject to inspections, so the fire marshal technically would have to go in and do a code compliant scan of the property, make sure fire exits are there, smoke detectors, whatever else, egresses aren't blocked, and those kind of things. I mean, I think during that, if they saw, I'm not sure if this was what you're asking, if they saw a mysterious looking fourth unit or something, I think then they would flag that and bring that to our attention.
Hey, Diane, I see a question from Donna. So the question is, how are the planning and zoning commissioners accountable to those who will be most deeply impacted by these changes if approved? So it's basically about accountability from an appointed group of commissioners. that that don't actually live in this East Norwalk. So
Actually, we do have one that does.
that's good.
Yeah. We actually have, well,
That's an
one right
improvement.
in this, right, probably walking distance to where a lot of you guys are right now,
Nice.
and have in the past as well.
But anyway, so the question still stands, though. So it's about accountability.
Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. They're an appointed body, appointed by the mayor and common council. They're made up of representative of every district within the city. They're, you know, we've informed them of every meeting to try to plug in whenever they can, you know, like everybody else, to hopefully go back and watch as many of these videos as possible to get a sense of this. What, you know, like I said before, we're getting kind of some common themes. I think the biggest one is the change from folks who are going from 1 to 2 family. I don't know how to answer it in terms of otherwise for accountability, because they're appointed. So if there was somebody who didn't like their,
the point is they're appointed by the mayor, so they're accountable only to him, more so.
yeah. So if and the, you know, I guess the council has to approve the nominations as well. But if there was an outcry that this individual was derelict in their duties for some reason, I guess they could bring that to the mayor or their council person's attention, and they can decide what to do.
Okay.
But they're all free to disagree with any recommendation that staff makes at any time.
Well, Steve, since this isn't an application that's from a developer or any outside stakeholder, is there a reason why this process couldn't go through the Common Council as well, so that the elected officials have the accountability that Scott's talking about, that's not inherent in appointed?
Well, I mean, statutorily, the only group that can make changes to the zoning regulations are the Planning and Zoning Commission, first and foremost. So council doesn't get a vote.
Right, to
I mean,
ultimately vote on it, but does that mean that it can't go to the Common Council to be discussed and voted on by them in terms of whether they think this should go through or not?
Yeah, voted on, no. Obviously, we value their input, and like I was there a week or two ago with the ECD committee. I told them I would come back either June or July to go through, and they wanted regular updates over a period of time. So we'll do that. We've talked or offered to talk to every council person about what we're doing, the changes within their district, and why we're making the recommendations, and took their input into account. And I'm sure there'll be further conversations with them as they hear from the constituents on specific areas or items that they're concerned with.
Yeah, I hope our two are on this call, although I can't see all the names that are here. But the other question I have, while I'm waiting for Scott for the next person, and Steve, I hope you can stay on for a few minutes, is
Sure.
So I'm seeing we've had anywhere from like 28 to 36 people, I think, on the call, in and out. And
You're at 41 right now.
But is it okay? And so we have, but we reach like literally, I think, well over 1,000 people. And then when you take into households, even more than that. So not necessarily a great turnout here. And the point speaks to the fact that there's not a lot of people who are aware of this at all. It shouldn't fall to the neighborhood associations, number one, to really kind of do this, but what is the city planning on doing to make sure that an actual homeowner knows that their zone, their house could potentially change? Are you going to do a mailing before this public hearing to every property owner? Even if you're not required to do it, are you going to do it?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it. Thank you. We're actually working on that right now. I'm hoping to, I've been talking to, initially we were going to try to piggyback with the tax collectors mailing, but they expressed some reservation, and rightly so, because they said when they've done that in the past, they get all the calls about whatever the extra information was within their mailing. So we're going to do our own postcard mailing that we're talking to the printer and just trying to make sure we have the right addresses for everybody to who it's going to. So our goal is to send that out before those hearings to give people notice that there's these hearings coming up and here's where you can go to get information on what's being changed. If we could utilize the robocall aspect, I'd love to do that, but I don't know if we're going to be permitted to do that or not.
So the postcard would just say there's some changes coming and here's where to go to find out, but it wouldn't say your parcel is zoned as Zone B and we're recommending changing you to CD something.
No, I don't think we could do that in any kind of timely fashion, because that would have to be tailored for, I think there's 22,000 properties, something like that. So I don't know how we would do that for every single person. I think we're just saying, hey, we're making changes to the zoning. There's going to be some impact or change on your property. Here's where you go to, see what the changes are. If you have questions, contact here, and there's hearings scheduled for these dates.
We have some more hands up here.
Yeah, I see some more hands. I see Roger, Allison. There's also a couple of more questions in chat. I think Lisa got off mute, but Roger, you want to start us up?
Hi, this is Lisa Roger, and I have two questions. At the District C zoning meeting, it was asked if any of the commissioners have taken a ride around some of the proposed zoning area changes. And Steve, you mentioned that you would bring that up and ask them if they have or will be doing that. So that's one. And then my second question is, how do any of these zoning changes affect affordability of low-income residents, especially those who work right here in Norwalk?
So I can't tell you who's gone out and looked at what. I'm happy to convey that message, or I won't be there, but I'll have somebody convey that message to the commission. They have a meeting Wednesday night. So, we talked to them about that. So they're aware that the public is asked about those changes. Specifically, it's come up with the areas going from the, up zone from the 1 to the 2, where they want people to take a look at the street. So I think that's a perfectly reasonable request, and I'll continue to convey that. Second question was impacts on affordability. So a couple different things with the changes to going from, and like I said, and I'm going to beat a dead horse with this, but allowing somebody the opportunity to potentially buy one unit of a 2-family is a cheaper entry port into the housing market than a single family is. It's just the way it bears out. Right now, the zoning regulations require that every multifamily development, so that's anything 3 or more, provide workforce housing, which is permanently deed restricted housing, which is based on state median income, has nothing to do with what the Norwalk market is, even though that factors into it, but it doesn't directly impact it. Or they pay a fee if they don't quite have up to 10 units. So that's required with each development. We've added a couple different provisions related to our workforce housing as part of the rewrite. But some of this, some things, that's a really loaded conversation with affordable housing, because there's a lot of things beyond zoning that impact or should impact affordable housing.
Right, and that's, affordable housing for 3 or more units requiring affordable housing, but now we're talking about going from a 1-family to a 2-family, and a lot of our low-income residents, no matter how much a price of a house is or a home, it's not going to be easy for a low-income family to purchase homes, and essentially we're just driving away low-income people who work here in our city, and not, there's just not enough affordable housing in Norwalk at all, and I don't see these zoning changes doing anything to help that at all.
It's simple. By simply adding additional housing and different housing choice, you're increasing options and increasing affordability. So that in and of itself is an addition to that. It can't guarantee that The zoning regulations can't address every aspect of the housing problem. That's why we have the housing authority and some other entities that are involved with different levels of affordability. I mean, it's just tricky to do it all through zoning. I don't think that's the only vehicle to address that.
Okay, I've had Lisa's iPhone off mute for a
Yep.
minute or two. Lisa, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks. Hi, Steve. Lisa Britton here. I think I said this in one of the other sessions. I grew up out west with duplexes all my life, and the duplexes were as nice as the houses. They were largely owner occupied, so I have no problem with structures necessarily. The problem is this: we live in Connecticut, which is probably the most segregated housing in the country, despite all of its claims of being quite liberal. No, you talked about market forces are driving the need for two family. Why it seems to only be uniquely being driven in the city of Norwalk versus Darien, Westport, New Canaan, Wilton. You get my drift. The only other two towns or cities, municipalities that you said were doing this sort of zoning were Bridgeport and Hartford. And that leads me to my question, and I brought this up before, is that this is what scares every single family homeowner who bought there. And like I said, I almost looked at buying over. I tried multiple times when I moved from Rowayton. I tried to get over into Charles Cove. So I have no problem with multi-dimensional housing. I didn't get into Charles Cove. I ended up settling here in Sherburne Park. But my point is that we have an absolutely poor record of enforcement. Two-family housing in Norwalk is synonymous with rental, which is synonymous with lack of enforcement. And so, I don't think you didn't assure me in the last meeting in South Norwalk that you can't deal with enforcement. And so when you sit there and you talk about the regulations about how they'll have to design a two-family and where the parking will be, I think everyone who's got a single-family home is petrified there will be no enforcement. And market forces means we're going to start turning into a Bridgeport or a Hartford, which I just don't think that that's a positive message for the city of Norwalk. Can you make me feel better than I did a couple of weeks ago? And I don't know what everybody else here in East Norwalk thinks on that, but I suspect that seems to be the common concern that most of us in single family neighborhoods that are being converted to two family are worried about. It's blight and the overcrowding and just the general devaluation of our single largest asset.
So I can answer part of that, and I'm going to probably have to answer a question to answer your other question. I just to clarify that the market forces aren't saying we need the two family. The market, what I was saying was the market will dictate whether it's a one family or a two family. It won't be, the zoning won't dictate that. The market, it will do what the market feels is more appropriate. The zoning would allow the one or the two family, and that provides opportunity for somebody to do that. We're not mandating one or the other, saying you could do one or the other. Regarding enforcement, are you talking about what specifically in relation to enforcement?
Well, we don't have it. You talked about the design specifications of where the cars go, yada, yada, yada. What a two family needs to look like. It can't look like a box, which is what most of them have looked like historically. I just want to know, how would that even be enforced? We don't have an architectural review board. And like I said, I know this isn't you as planning and zoning, but we have virtually no enforcement. I mean, we in terms of ordinance and zoning violations. I mean, I know if you're out west, I mean, my mom's out in Arizona. I was out in Utah. My mom's got a house there. She's not in all the time. I mean, anything goes wrong with that house, and she gets a letter from Salt Lake City, which is a hell of a lot bigger city than Norwalk is, right? Same thing with Scottsdale. We have historically been, a city that acts like a town and has been pretty lazy. And so now you're seeing here about just increasing this density, and we just don't have a track record for enforcing anything. And so this is what, we're all worried. We've got these houses that are going to suddenly have two family that could turn into a three family, and who knows what it's going to look like. And it's just, I think that's the concern is past behavior. And there's just I'm not saying you, but there is a complete, utter lack of confidence and trust in the administration simply because of history.
So every new, any new building that's subject to the form-based code, which would be the 2-family and up. Not everything goes to the commission, but a duplex, duplex not going to go to the commission, at least the way the regulations are structured. So if someone's putting a new 2-family, it's got to get reviewed and permitted. So they have to submit plans that are, and I'm saying plans, so that would be a survey, engineered plans, architectural plans. All those need to be compliant with all the standards within the zone if you're going to put up a 2-family. So that regulates the type of materials, what the massing and the shape is, landscaping, where the parking is located. So all that has to get reviewed and checked prior to the permit being issued. Before they can get their certificate of occupancy to actually move in and occupy the house, that gets inspected by our staff, and we do that with all new construction now. And they have to provide all the supporting documentation in terms of as-built surveys, drainage certification, et cetera. So once it's CO'd, that project should be completely consistent with the regulations. What happens after the fact if somebody decides to sneak an apartment in the basement? That's a little bit beyond our control. If we get a complaint, we respond to it, but I can't preemptively tell them, I think you're going to do it. But if we find out or we get a complaint about it, we respond to it.
Allison, you want to unmute? You're off. Go for it.
So I am new here. I moved here about a year ago, and this talk is actually making me feel a little bit nervous that I purchased here in East Norwalk because, I looked in a lot of other places, Chapin, Rowayton, and what I loved about this area is that it had, while it was part of a larger, a city, it had a very small beach community vibe to it that I really liked. I still am confused as to why the city feels that this is necessary to do in this area. I don't quite understand it. To me, 2-family housing feels very, I think, people will see an opportunity to make money, which isn't a terrible thing, except for that maybe just not here, but it feels very transient. There'll be a lot of rentals and, it's people that aren't invested. As homeowners, you tend to just not take as good care of an area as they maybe would. And I do think it brings down the value of these. There are some beautiful, beautiful homes in East Norwalk. And I think you start turning those into 2-family homes, it changes the landscape. I think it's a mistake to do it. And I just am curious as to what other towns that you can point out that are similar to this city and this town, this area, that have done this or felt the need to do this. I also just really quickly want to ask, in addition to there being any other cities in Fairfield County that feel it necessary to do this, is there a way, the second part of my question, to do this in a smaller area, like just maybe west of I-95, where it's a little bit more dense and there's more, you have a lot more businesses and it's so much more residential east of 95. So I'm just curious if they have to start with such a large area to do it, or can there be a trial where it does not include East Norwalk, but the other places that you've discussed?
So as I kind of mentioned earlier, there are some areas that we're already talking about that, would probably make sense to pull that back from. I don't have that all in front of me tonight to talk about. I don't think we pattern anything we do necessarily on what community A or community B does. We obviously look around for what we think are good ideas or bad ideas to model ourselves up, but we make decisions on or recommendations on changes to land use based on what we feel is appropriate for Norwalk, and that gets backed up by the 2019 citywide plan, which kind of is the guiding document of how and why we should develop.
And can I ask you, what made you think that this was necessary for Norwalk?
So I talked about this quite a few times. You know, this area, and Norwalk's included in it, is one of the most expensive places in the country to live in terms of housing. We're in a housing shortage, we're housing burdened, housing cost burdened, and there's no inventory. That we are one of the lowest vacancy rates in the country. So when you put those two things together, it's a horrible formula. So we're trying to come up with different avenues in areas that are centered around our transit, our infrastructure, and our job areas to incrementally add in additional housing. We're not, as I mentioned, the overall change, which I think, like I said, it's going to be reduced, is only 5% of the existing single family areas.
5% of what? What is the number? 5% of
the entire.
Yeah. So how many, what are we talking? How many single family homes are there? It's 5%. So you know that number. What is it 5% of? 100,000 homes, 10 homes?
I don't have the number out, but I mentioned we're going to post the an information sheet that has all that data in it, and hopefully that's up. Should be by the beginning of next week if it's not up this week, but that'll have all the information on total number of households, existing single family, existing two family, proposed 1 to 2. We'll have all that up there. And you can take a look at it. And
can I ask one more question? I'm so sorry. I just, like I said, I'm new to this. So I probably have stuff that you are repeating, and I apologize for that. But when you say that there's no inventory and we are the highest in the housing market, where did that information come from? Because that doesn't sound quite right to me.
It's U.S. Census Bureau. For the most part, U.S. Census Bureau, and it's been backed up by
2019.
I think it was 2020. There was the last count. I think there's additional ACS, which is American Community Service data, that backs that up. And that's been backed up by some other studies. And we were happy to post all those links as well.
Okay, I think we have probably time for a couple more minutes if Steve is willing to stay on, because we hit 9 o'clock. Is there anyone else from East Norwalk proper 06855?
Is Donna fit that bill?
Donna's in Shorefront, but we can go over to Donna. And I would just want to say to Steve, though, first, Donna, just to remind Steve that East Norwalk, again, I think is the most densely populated per acre in terms of any neighborhood in the city. And we've already been subjected to the TOD zoning and the EVTZ zoning. So our share now of density really should be like, that's kind of it in terms of the changes here. We're doing, we've done our part. We objected to it. It's here now, and it's going to increase the density. And as far as we know now, it's not going to do anything for affordability. Hopefully that would change, but we've already really been kind of under siege. So
can you expand on that? Because I mean, that point gets raised a lot, and it confuses me quite a bit. Let me ask my question. Yeah. What project? I mean, and it comes out a lot of different means we've had. What project that's been built in East Norwalk has negatively impacted anybody? I'd be curious to know what you thought.
Well, it's more the potential in terms of the zoning that you've already done that the community was objected to, which was TOD, which was the most of the entire area, that half-mile radius, but more importantly, the East Avenue Village Transit Zone, which has the possibility for maximum density from I-95 all the way to Cemetery Street. The potential build out there, when you include what was I-1, as you've told the community before, is the potential for 1,200 apartment units. And so that's part of what I'm talking about. Whether or not it ever comes to fruition, what has already been zoned here alone has the potential tomorrow or over whatever time frame to add 1,200 apartments. So to other people's questions, I don't know why there's a further target of East Norwalk to go from 1 to 2 family and not achieve, probably not achieve affordability and just add the density here. In terms of those developments, we've already had complaints about overflow parking from Winfield Street. We know there's going to be issues in terms of strain on the city services from Cemetery Street. There's concerns with the development that went up next to Dunkin' Donuts, where you allowed them to take out the front lawn and put in paved parking, and having people come in and out of that driveway is a concern. And now the potential to encroach on Van Zandt Street and Rowan Street, even though we specifically asked not to go off of East Avenue with these plans. So I think it's a legitimate concern. East Norwalk has already ponied up under TOD. And we were prior to TOD, again, you can dispute me if you want, but we're already the densest population per acre in the city.
So just a couple things. The Winfield Street application, you'll recall the commission actually denied the special permit request. And had the rezoning gone through earlier, that current project could not have been built there. And same with the project at the Dunkin' Donuts property. That would not be what it is today. It definitely wouldn't look like it is today.
Yeah. Okay. And actually both of those parcels could have been changed prior to TOD, just so you're not blaming East Norwalk for holding up TOD for those zones. Just want to get that out there. They could have been changed at any time prior to that.
Well, that would have probably been a spot zoning exercise, and we would have been ridiculed for that, I'm sure.
Okay, Donna.
Thank you, Diane. I want to circle back to several of the points that other people have made about the feasibility and advisability of upzoning a historically single-family neighborhoods to two-family. If there is, I would assume when you're talking about the census information, it isn't limited, it isn't granular to Norwalk, that is Fairfield County generally. And to Lisa Britton's point earlier, then all of Fairfield County should be trying to add density, not just Norwalk. So I know that we belong to the Western Connecticut Coalition of Governments. I don't know if this has come up on any agenda because the mayor misses so many of those meetings, but perhaps West Cog would be the place for these conversations to occur about how do we relieve some of the pressure on people who would like to buy in Fairfield County generally. Singling out Norwalk for special treatment seems a little just intuitively unfair, because I know people who live within half a mile of other train stations and they are not being upzoned to two-family. With respect to upzoning to two-family, again, circling back to what Lisa Britton said about enforcement, Steve spoke to enforcement for the certificate of occupancy, but you admitted today and previously that P&Z has no way to enforce illegal occupancies. And illegal occupancies are, I think everyone knows it, it's no secret. These are one of the biggest problems in the city of Norwalk is enforcement of illegal occupancy. You know that you can't enter a two-family home. So how does it serve the interest of the city? And I have another question after this. So how does it serve our interest as citizens and yours as someone who's trying to enforce the codes to add housing stock where there is a known problem with code enforcement? I mean, if you already have a problem there, it seems to me that intuitively you would be adding, four family, three and four family. So that's one question. And then the other question is, and I put it in the chat box, there are new people here like Allison. I'm sure there's some other ones who don't understand the diagram on the city site about how the city works and who is accountable to whom. And I did ask in the chat window, the people who vote on this, can you explain to who they are accountable? Are they accountable to voters? Because we do have an election coming up. Or can we vote zoning commissioners, planning and zoning commissioners out of office? Or how does the accountability play out here if we are unhappy with the way that the commissioners vote? And then boy, I had another question and it just, oh, yes. So the hearing is still scheduled right now for the 21st of June, but you have said that some of the changes are going to be rolled back. So that means that we don't know what those are, right? So no one here on the call, and most of us, I think, are living in a single family neighborhood scheduled for upzoning. We don't know what those neighborhoods are going to be. And so that really argues strongly for postponing the hearing into the fall to give everybody a chance to digest, because if you're going to be rolling back some of these changes, the proposed change from a single to two family, then, we should be prepared for that. And I think what happens when you throw that out there, it makes everyone kind of breathe this little sigh of relief. And that's a little bit unfair. We should all be on our guard right now, because if it's not happening in my neighborhood, it's happening in the neighborhood next door. So anyway, that was like 3 questions. If you wouldn't mind answering those, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure, I flagged 4, and I think you already live in a 2-family zone, if I'm not correct, but I can double check that.
I do not live in a 2-family zone. We are zoned single family. We always have been, and it's in the land record as single family only, Shorefront Park.
I don't think your particular area is, but I'll double check that.
You were incorrect about that. So this came up at our meeting, Steve. I mean, you had multiple people from Shorefront Park at the District B meeting, and we all said the same thing.
The bulk of Shorefront Park is single family, but the northern street up through there it's existing C zone, but that's fine. No,
it's not. My street, I am on the northern edge, and it is all there. You're talking about two lots, maybe.
All right, I'll double check that. To answer your questions, starting with West Cog and the surrounding towns. So there are agencies and groups, you may have heard of Desegregate Connecticut, who are, I would say, actively pursuing additional density and targeting a lot of the towns, in this area. And there's a bill that's still moving through the state where they would require certain densities in and around train stations. This has been, this is, I think, the 3rd iteration of this kind of process over the last 2 or 3 legislative sessions. We would be exempt on that based on the density at the South Norwalk train station in and of itself, but they're actually being targeted. Those communities are also subject to state legislation, which is 8-30G, which is kind of known as the zoning busting legislation. If they don't have 10% of their housing stock permanently deeded I shouldn't say permanently, but deeded affordable by the metrics they provide in that statute, then they are subject to these applications where a developer can throw the zoning code out the window. We're not subject to that because we meet the affordability requirements already. I'll have to go look, but I don't think there's anything that I said or that there's evidence of that existing 2-family housing is a problem for enforcement or leads to a proliferation of additional illegal units. I mean, I don't know if that is more problematic in 1 families versus 2 families or 3 families or 4 families. At illegal units and illegal unit, and we're not helpless to do something. We have to actually be able to get in the property and verify that there's a violation first on that, but that starts with a complaint. Then the last question you had was related to postponing, or I guess maybe related to the hearings and accountability of the commissioners. So they're appointed by the mayor and the common council. So if you are, the electorate, I guess, is dissatisfied with any of those individuals, I would say voice your concern to your elected officials that you would like to see new bodies on there. I mean, that's the process.
Steve, should people be writing into the Planning and Zoning Commission, which, by the way, we can't, and I hope you're going to address this, but we can't communicate with Planning and Zoning Commissioners directly regarding changes and applications, but can people also write into you directly in care of you to the commissioners now, instead of just waiting for the questionnaire form or the feedback form to be compiled by the consultants and everything, so that they start seeing the one, the pushback, but more importantly, I know this isn't the only neighborhood you've heard that's concerned with this June public hearing. And that may be the matter that needs to be addressed first. And wouldn't they direct you in terms of if they felt the same concern, or they agreed with the community? Shouldn't they know that now so that they can address that and move this thing out?
So we've been getting feedback. We've got, either through email, online, or letters. Once we take care of some of the work I was talking about related to the data with the two-family housings, we're going to download, compile all the comments received, and then provide a staff response to each one of those and get those to the commission. My goal is to do that within the next couple of weeks, so they get a sense of what we've heard. And I think we've apprised them. I think a lot of it's related to the changing, which you just mentioned, from the 1 to the 2 family. So I think they're well aware that there are concerns expressed in different parts of the city about that change. So we'll provide an answer and a recommendation on some changes, and then hopefully they get some of those get the commission's in consensus right from the get-go at the first hearing. Like, yeah, it makes sense to pull these areas out for now, and we'll further evaluate other areas as we go through the process.
How do you intend to post a legal notice for this? Is it going to list every affected parcel? Because wouldn't a property owner have a reasonable or be entitled to a reasonable notice? And if the only statutory thing is a legal notice, are you going to take out several pages and list every parcel? And would it be the parcel ID, which I don't know my parcel ID, but I know my address.
I have to, we kind of had some preliminary discussions with our council about that. I don't think we have to list every parcel. I don't think we're going to do that. Just we might take up the entire paper with that, and the way the legal notice costs are, I think that's kind of cost prohibitive, but we'll provide, I think one of the things we're going to do with the postcard we're going to mail out is indicate that we intend to have an additional hearing on adoption in September, that that this is where you will find out the date for that, and stay plugged in through that. But we will run whatever is required in terms of notice.
And I think it's that adoption meeting that people are concerned about too, because there's going to be a gap then when the public is really fully able to be engaged, and then there'll be an adoption hearing, but there should be another one that's in between there. And this is why I'm saying to shift this thing, where people then understand all of the possible changes or proposed changes before there's anything with the commission. Again, that's called an adoption hearing. Again, especially before the election, it doesn't make sense. In fact, I would go so far as to say that this thing needs to be pushed out to, after the new year, in terms of the whole vetting and everything, or closer to the end of the year, and then more meetings, because this is just too overwhelming at this point for people to understand what's happening on their own street, their own community, much less the impact on the city, because we really haven't talked about the potential impact on the city of city services and infrastructure and everything else. So that's another concern here. But by the way, too, Steve, that feedback that you're talking about, the compilation of the comments and everything that then your staff is going to comment on and provide to the commission, when you provide that document to the commission, it will be made public at the same time, correct?
Yeah, we'll post that. And I promise we're not editing anybody's comments. So whatever you pose, we'll leave as is and respond.
Can I ask a question? Because you actually brought up something how does adding these additional two-family homes affect the town services, like garbage and all that? I mean, have you guys delved into that part of the study to see what economic impact it would have? You would have to hire, I assume, more garbage men, more, it would affect the water situation. There's already been an issue with when we can use sprinklers, when we can't use sprinklers. now we're adding more people. I'm just not sure like how this affects everything else. Waste management, you know.
Sure. And nobody believes me when I say this, but the good thing is you don't have to believe me because it's not my data. So water consumption has actually is forecast to actually continue to decrease. I know it's not to say that we won't have a drought and there might not be times where they restrict your water. That's something beyond anybody's control. But the actual water consumption is forecast to decrease, even though population has increased, and that's by and large due to efficiency that gets built into the new projects and where they replace old infrastructure with new infrastructure and install new high efficiency, toilets and sinks and those kind of things. In terms of wastewater treatment plant, we've had this conversation with them numerous times. They're well aware of what we're doing with the zoning and the larger projects that we've anticipated. They're at present, and I'm not the WPCA spokesman, but there at present is plenty of capacity. Each project that comes in needs to get their approval as well. So if they say there's a capacity problem or there's an infrastructure problem and you have to address that, then it would also get vetted by that organization as part of this. When we did rezoning, I think with South Norwalk and maybe even with West Ave Wall Street, we talked about police and, did these additional apartments and things lead to additional calls and were burdensome or require additional officers. And at that time, it wasn't an issue. And the kind of changes we're talking about now, like when we redid the rezoning on Merit 7 a couple of years ago, year and a half ago, maybe, that was a wholesale change where it was a significant increase in an anticipated short amount of time based on the schedule the developer was thinking about. What we're talking about here, this going from a one family to a two family on a street, it's going to take decades before there are significant changes in the amount and the makeup of these streets. So it's not going to have, these changes are not going to be seen right away. It's just not going to happen. None of this, even, your fears about East Avenue with the developments, the one cemetery project was the least kept secret in town. We knew that they wanted to do something there at the onset of the TOD project 4 or 5 years ago now. And then we've since then seen one other project come in that, they withdrew it. If they didn't withdraw it, it was going to get declined anyway. So I don't think you're going to see these wholesale immediate changes. It's just not realistic to think that way.
And just one other thing. So assuming that goes towards like schools as well, has anyone looked into adding these additional families and how that will affect the schools and the districts?
Yeah, and that was brought up, I think, at the one cemeteries meeting too, which I thought was really a false narrative because we've done.
How is that a false narrative?
It is because the school population, two different ways I'll answer it. The school population has not increased because of the apartments that are added. They actually add very few to the school, and the school's population of number of students from early 2000s to 2021 school year, it was like a 4% increase. It's not, it's very incremental, very slow. And some of their projections are actually to decrease at certain points too. So a lot of these infrastructure questions just haven't come to be backed up by the data that's available. And it's not my data. So please don't accept my word for it. Do your own research.
Okay, I think it's after 9 o'clock, Steve. We want to certainly thank you for, like I said, sometimes it's coming into the lion's den, and we know that. We appreciate you being willing to do that, and also to take 2 hours this evening to spend with us. I'm sure there'll be more questions. We urge people to get those into ENNA, but also submit, again, questions, comments, concerns, suggestions through the website that Steve showed you. Coincidentally, Steve, if this public hearing does stay for June 21st, and again, please change that, just so ENNA folks know, our next regularly monthly meeting is June 19th. And in all likelihood, then that would be devoted to final preparation for the public hearing. And I'll just put, I forgot to put your information up here, Steve, but I'll just rattle it off. So it's like Steve Kleppin, his name there, KLEPPIN at norwalkct.gov. And you can reach out to him directly if there's a specific question you'd like to ask him or his staff. And if there is information or any communication you want to have with the Planning and Zoning Commission, it does go in care of Mr. Kleppin. So you'll want to do that as well. And then folks can stay on if they want, if anybody has any other questions, but just so that other people know, information can also be found at eastnorwalk.org. We're a little behind, as always, in getting things posted there, but we're also on social media and tend to get things up a little bit faster. And you can email into us at info@eastnorwalk.org. Okay, so we thank Steve Kleppin for joining us. As always, at the end of our meetings, I do volunteer to stay on if anybody has questions or if they want to bring up any neighborhood issues or anything else that you'd like to discuss. Whoops, I see stuff popping up in chat here though, so.
That was cemetery. Me. That was me typing as well as now I've raised my hand.
Okay, hi Roger.
This is Dave Roger.
Oh, Dave Rogers, hi.
Hi. At the start of the meeting before Steve came in, you had some agenda items to talk about what's happening with the lawsuit for cemetery and we didn't have the opportunity to get into that. So I'm just especially curious about the neighbors' actions on the cemetery development.
So the updates on that are going to be via the newsletter, but right now, so the appeal was filed, and we're looking at following the docket and then meeting with the lawyer again in terms of getting what the next steps are. But I think one of the appellants had looked up that in the docket that the next kind of significant portion is called the return date, and that's at the end of May. And as I recall, the attorney had actually said there's not a whole lot that happens. There's like a gap in time from the time that you file the appeal to when things start actually happening. So we hope to know some next steps and what's going on in the next couple of weeks.
And on the, I think it was 49 Van Zandt, there was discussion about that the peer review really panned the proposal. And even one of our favorite commissioners indicated that everyone should read that peer review. And is that review available? I'm very curious what they had to say.
Oh yeah, in fact, all of the comment and all the documentation regarding it is on the same city website where all the zoning applications are posted. So
even though it was withdrawn? Even though it was withdrawn, it's still available?
Yeah, I believe. That's actually a good point because I'm not quite sure what section you would have put it on, but it was actually there as of last week. So I'll double check that because if they don't have a tab now for withdrawn documents, then and we should certainly make sure that they have it because it is something that came before the city. In lieu of that, I actually downloaded some of it, so I'll see if I can find it. But it wasn't just the design review, though, too, Dave. It was also the city's own staff through transportation, mobility, and parking. They had a laundry list of concerns as well, some of which there was a lot of overlap between what ENNA submitted and what the actual staff and peer reviews were.
Oh, okay.
But I'll see if that has been pulled. I'll see if it can go back up, and if not, I'll make sure that that we can provide the copy. I can do that in an email and get that to you as well.
Okay.
But I do want to say I don't want to be snarky about it, but as I was reading both of those significant feedback reports from the design review as a third-party consultant, and also the city's transportation, mobility, and parking, which is our own staff. As I was reading through their concerns, all I kept thinking to myself was, these are all the same concerns that we raised about One Cemetery Street.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying two wrongs make a right, but it's a little bit, I don't know, it was almost like,
It's disingenuous to ignore it on one and call it out on the other.
exactly. And the other thing that we're concerned about, and actually somebody brought this up to me because it hadn't occurred to me because I don't know, but is that the withdrawal versus asking for an extension of time. I'm going to go back to the applicant's attorney to find out why she and her clients decided to do that. Because it may not just be that they're going to go back and rework their plan and address some of these serious concerns that we all raised. It could be now that there was enough of a glimpse of this new zoning regulations. But just as Steve suggested early on in the evening, he said that there probably are people now who are either going to race to get stuff in that's beneficial to them before the new zoning regulations come through, or there are people looking at it and saying, heck, I can wait 6 months and put in something that's even more advantageous to the developer. So I want to try to find out some more information about what they intend to do with it, or if it's just dead at this point.
And every time I drive by, I guess it's Rogers Square, the former strip mall that burned and then got rebuilt, and now it's just been in limbo. I just view that as boy, if I were a developer, that's just a beautiful little parcel to put up another 4-story building. And I'm kind of waiting for that to happen. I can just see it all happening. Somebody trying to, they got to buy the giant laundry and they got to buy the gas station, and now they've got a nice parcel. Something's got to be going on there.
I got to tell you that sometimes I tend to lean to like maybe the worst case too, and that if that were to happen, that might not even be the worst thing that can happen there, because the same owners who own that parcel are the owners who own the former Howard Johnson's lot at exit 16. And who negotiated what is one of the most astronomical land purchases by the DOT to be used as a staging area that I've ever seen. In fact, in terms of purchasing it, normally they rent stuff, but my sense is that they may be holding out now, and it could be something that could end up being a municipal or a state deal. And that might be even more objectionable than a 3.5-story mixed use residential. Especially as a number of people continue to throw around things that are called a fancy name for garages, which is public parking facilities. So it does make me nervous because of the players that are involved. When I look at the city, the state, and those particular property owners, I won't name them, but they are absentee owners that own that parcel in Pennies and the one they just sold at exit 16, the old Howard Johnson's.
Or they're
It's
just
always
waiting
been
for
a disappointment, though, that our economic development director in that department hasn't made more of a proactive attempt to try to persuade that that parcel to be used, but there's nothing that compels a property owner to have to do anything with it. So,
or they too are just waiting for these new regs to go into place.
Yeah, could be. And in the past, we've speculated that it's some sort of a tax advantage to have something that you're saying that you're looking to rent and you can't rent it. And so there's probably some tax advantages to that, to have it, kind of unimproved and not rented. But we're a little disappointed in the city that they haven't. Although I do have to be fair, I believe a few years ago when we talked with the mayor about it, he had said that both himself and his staff had at that point made at least one attempt to reach out, and it wasn't well received.
Okay,
the
thanks,
other
Diane.
parcel, of course, that we're super concerned with is St. Thomas, the former church at St. Thomas School, because under the regulations that Steve put in terms of density in that corridor, you can't even have a 1-story building. There are now, which is kind of bizarre, that you would have a minimum height. Normally you look at zoning and you look at land uses, and almost always they're restricting maximum heights. But for them to take the corridor and make it minimum 2.5 stories, that's another piece of property we'd be very concerned about. I don't think I see anybody there we go. I see Nicole. Hi, Nicole.
Oh, no. How you doing? We don't want to leave. We're soaking it all in.
Oh, okay. There you go. There you go. Okay.
But thank you so much for everything.
You're welcome. Thanks everybody for showing up. I was really hoping for hundreds and hundreds of people, but I think, it's the nature of communication, and after the battles that we've had the past few years, people are kind of just, they're kind of over it and kind of like, why bother? But, it was a pretty good turnout, and hopefully people stay engaged here. Thank you to George, one of our board members that's on there. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. To be continued. Read
Thanks,
the
Diane. Thanks, Scott.
newsletters.
Thanks,
Thank
Diane.
you, Dave.
And thank you
Thanks,
for
Scott.
getting Steve in here for what it was worth.
Exactly. Yep. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Have a
Bye.
good night.